armaments industry. There are about 700,000 of these women workers. But there's another 840,000 women doing other types of non-industrial work. But for the munitionettes in government factories, the government gets very concerned that it must look after the moral welfare of these workers. These women who are away from home and therefore prey to, and with income in their pocket. You know, for many women, it's the time that they have, you know, the first decent wages, and that they have to be morally looked after. And it's at this point that the government comes up with the idea, not just of welfare supervisors, but of a women's police service, to make sure that women can police women, to check that they're behaving well and that they're not pestered by their male colleagues. So, the state is involved in industrial production to an unprecedented degree. I now want to switch to the story of rationing, because it's about the way in which the state becomes involved in distribution. Okay? Not in production, but in distribution. And I'm going to do this very quickly. You know, because I've already told you this, that basically Britain had switched to becoming a nation dependent upon cheap food imports. Okay? And that the Germans therefore felt that a great way of getting of weakening the Britain's war effort was to use U-boats to destroy merchant shipping, to stop the food coming over from North America and Latin America. One of the consequences of that is that food becomes increasingly short, and therefore prices rise very dramatically. There are these very long queues, and even the return of food riots that hadn't been seen since the beginning of the early 19th century. No government at war wants to be in this situation where you can't feed your people and people can't afford to buy or can't get hold of food. Worse still, it becomes a real issue of political contention on the left. You have the formation of the War Emergency Workers National Committee, a ridiculous name, but one that was an organization that was very important and made the shortage of food a central component of a series of strikes that began to spread from 1915 and 1916 onwards. The government's response to all of this is to say, look, we can't possibly get involved here. We can't get involved in the market at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to propose that people voluntarily ration themselves. And a whole series of philanthropic organizations are set up, like the National Food Economy League, to try and promote forms of voluntary rationing. So, you know, make sure if you're wealthy that you're not eating too much, basically was the story. The Ministry of Food is established and makes this food economy of voluntary rationing a vital part of its operation, and it develops so-called national kitchens like the one that you see here, which are basically communal canteens where anyone can go and get a cheap hot meal. The idea then is that, you know, if you mass produce food, it will go longer. None of these things basically work. And by January 1917, they abandon all hope that voluntary rationing can work and impose compulsory rationing. Okay? So this is the point in which the state steps into the market in an unprecedented type of way, and the person responsible for this is a young civil servant called Beveridge, who is going to become a very important figure in the following 20 or 30 years. So remember that name. Very interestingly, what Beveridge does is set up a plan of rationing in which he created a consumers' council. So this is the first time a consumer council to advise the government on what consumers most wanted in terms of their rations and provisions. So this is the first time that you begin to see the idea of the consumer as an organized political force. They actually have remarkably little power, but it's a symbolically very important step. So, we've had the government stepping into production, we've had the government stepping into distribution, and these last two things I'm going to talk about are basically the government's control over the bodies of its population. It's going to stop some point, isn't it, this bell? Yes. It's 12 o'clock. So I've already told you that in the first half of the war, Britain was entirely dependent upon volunteers for its soldiers. The scale of the casualties were such in 1915 that it was quickly clear that neither colonial soldiers, many of whom are not volunteers, or volunteers from Britain were going to be sufficient. And finally, in January 1916, the government imposes conscription. This is the first time in the history of Britain that the state has said, you are compelled to fight on our behalf. Remember, for much of the 18th century and previously, Britain had depended upon mercenaries. When they were fighting overseas, they would just hire other people to fight for them, or colonial troops. Always had a very, very small regular army. So for the first time, conscription is imposed for men between the ages of 18 and 41. And by 1918, that wasn't sufficient, so they extend it to people aged between 18 and 51. And critically, they refuse, well rather, refuse is the wrong word, they think it politically not expedient to introduce conscription to Ireland in 1916. Remember, this is the island that had just had the Great Rising, the Easter Rising. But in April 19, conscription is extended to Ireland as well. There is huge argument about the introduction of conscription. Liberals are fiercely, fiercely opposed to conscription. People in the Liberal Party are fiercely opposed to it. The Manchester Guardian, which is, of course, the paper that becomes the Guardian that we can now read outside at the Free Speech Movement cafe, which was the banner paper for sort of advanced liberals, led a long campaign against the introduction of conscription, as did the Independent Labour Party, which was a pacifist party and hadn't supported the declaration of war. And there was even this organisation, which was basically liberal inflection, called the No Conscription Fellowship, was full of liberal pacifists. When you get the introduction of conscription, that means you also get the creation of the conscientious objector, the people who refuse to fight, the people who refuse to be conscripted. 16,000 Britons refused to fight. But 3,500 of them agreed to be involved in the war effort in non-combatant roles, as often as nurses or people working supply chains, etc. Yeah, even doing clerical work. "6,000 conscientious objectors are imprisoned for refusing to do any type of war work, and are, of course, treated very badly in prison. Okay? It becomes a big series of campaigns to try and make the public aware of the inhuman treatment of conscientious objectors, who, of course, were not exactly beloved by the regular prison folk. Such was the contempt that they were held in. Remember, if men are getting handed out white feathers when they refuse to volunteer, if you refuse not to fight, it's the lowest of the possible low. And in 1918, these men actually lose their right to vote. Okay? They are told, you are effectively not a citizen because you refuse to support the state during the war. Okay, so a much, much more compulsive and interventionist role of the state in terms of conscription and their treatment of conscientious objectors, and their use of internment. Now, no one who lives in the Bay Area needs to be taught much about the history of internment. The islands of the Bay are full and rich in that history. But Britain had never had any experience of internment. Remember, it was only in 1905 that any type of Immigration Act had been introduced. This was a land that thought itself as the land of refuge for people anywhere in the world. By the First World War, that switches around very radically, and basically the German population are increasingly subject not just to abuse, to attacks on their shops, but finally to actual internment from May 1915. 30,000 men were interned, and the women and children deported, even if they had been born in Britain. The German population in Britain fell from 57,000 in 1914 to 22,000 in 1918. And it's during the attacks upon the German-speaking population in Britain that my family's name was changed from Vernum, V-E-R-N-U-M, to Vernon, okay, which sounds altogether more Anglo, or maybe, a little French, and therefore more respectable. So they thought. And finally, the dead. The state's treatment of the dead. And here I am shamelessly borrowing from the work of one of our fabulous graduate students, Andrew Keating, whose dissertation has just been completed on this very subject. So everything that I say is basically plagiarized from Andrew, except for I'm giving you this footnote recognizing his scholarly endeavor, so it isn't plagiarism. An important distinction that you need to know. Okay, so we already know, because I keep telling you that 1 million people in the British